Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Dr. Jack Newman's Guide to Breastfeeding by Dr. Jack Newman and Teresa Pittman. Narrated by Pam Ward. Quick start. How to use this book and your time wisely. Listening to a book about breastfeeding can feel daunting. Is there really that much to know about feeding your baby? The answer is yes. And no. Well, we believe all the information in this book is valuable and, in some cases, hard to find anywhere else. Not every mother or healthcare professional needs to know about every issue or challenge that is covered. And you certainly don't need to know about everything right away. So, here's a quick reference guide that will help you find the key information for you and your situation. Are you pregnant? Is this your first baby? Maybe you haven't made up your mind about breastfeeding or are looking for information to help you understand the differences between breastfeeding and formula feeding. Check out Chapter 1, Why Breastfeeding is Important. From there, you might like to go to Chapter 4, How Birth Affects Breastfeeding, and Chapter 5, The First Few Days. That may give you all you need to get off to a great start with breastfeeding. We'd encourage you to keep the book handy, though, in case you do run into challenges when your baby arrives, or later in your breastfeeding experience, and need some more information. If this is your second or later baby, perhaps you had difficulties or weren't able to breastfeed your first and are hoping to be better prepared this time around. In that case, you might want to also check out Chapter 2, Finding Good Breastfeeding Help, and Chapter 3, The Sale and Promotion of Artificial Baby Milk. If you had some specific issues, you can look up those chapters or sections. These may help you in figuring out what went wrong the first time around and guide you in getting the support you need. Do you have a brand new baby? Chapter 5, The First Few Days, will probably be your first destination. If you are having specific challenges, perhaps your nipples are sore or your baby has jaundice, look for the chapters dealing with those issues. If you are feeling discouraged or overwhelmed, listening to Chapter 1, Why Breastfeeding is Important, might give you some motivation to keep going. And Chapter 2, Finding Good Breastfeeding Help, might help you get in touch with the right support person. Chapter 20, Life with a Breastfed Baby, may help as well. Are you breastfeeding but having problems? You've come to the right place. The heart of this book is solving breastfeeding problems, and we have information about both common challenges and less common ones, with ideas that have worked for many mothers. The more common problems, sore nipples, sore breasts, have their own chapters. If your situation is more unusual, you may need to do further research on these topics. In discussing these common problems, we don't want to suggest that all mothers and babies will experience them. Many mothers breastfeed without difficulties, especially if they've had a good start and good advice right from the beginning. Others have minor challenges they can quickly solve on their own, or with a little help. And while the problem-solving sections tend to emphasize helping the baby to get more milk, breastfeeding is about more than milk. When all is going well, it's perfectly fine, even desirable, for the baby to have some relaxed times at the breast when he's just nibbling and enjoying the closeness and the soothing sensation of suckling. These are the moments that encourage a long-term breastfeeding relationship. Is breastfeeding going fine, but you've been told to wean because you are, choose one, needing to take medication, pregnant, scheduled to have some medical tests, going back to work, nursing a toddler or older child, or one of many other reasons? Listening for these topics should help you find your situation, along with information so that you can make an educated decision about whether or not to wean, though it's almost never necessary. We also have entire chapters on breastfeeding while on medication and the normal duration of breastfeeding. Are you a health professional, lactation consultant, or La Leche League leader using this book as a reference as you work with breastfeeding mothers? We think you'll find this book a comprehensive guide to solving breastfeeding problems. We also encourage you to look at Chapter 1, Why Breastfeeding is Important, Chapter 2, Finding Good Breastfeeding Help, and Chapter 3, The Sale and Promotion of Artificial Baby Milk. Taken together, these 3 chapters explain how most mothers find themselves in a situation where they want to breastfeed, yet end up weaning sooner than they would like, often after weeks of struggling. For all our listeners, each of the chapters in the book, other than the first, begins with one or more of the myths or misconceptions that people often believe about breastfeeding. We highlight these because they are so common and often create barriers for women who want to breastfeed. Then we let you know the reality behind the myth, with accurate information so you can make educated decisions. In many places, we mention research and studies that have been done on breastfeeding and related issues. Since the book is already quite long, we haven't included them, but they are all listed at www.breastfeedinginc.ca in case you'd like to read them. We often also refer to video clips, which are hosted on the International Breastfeeding Center's YouTube channel, http://youtube.com/user/I, Toronto. The videos will help you see some of the techniques that can be hard to explain in writing. Introduction. Why is this breastfeeding book unique? Surely there are enough books, articles, and pamphlets on breastfeeding available that another is not necessary. Women have, of course, managed to breastfeed throughout the human race's time on Earth without the benefit of breastfeeding experts. In fact, even today there are women who do things very differently from what most lactation experts would recommend. Their babies are not latched on well. They stick to scheduled feedings. They hold the baby in awkward positions. And yet they manage to breastfeed successfully. For too many women, though, this isn't the case. With good help, they will succeed at breastfeeding. Without it, they may not. Good information is often hard to find. Mothers get conflicting advice from their doctors, the hospital nurses, their own mothers and friends, and the books they read. It can be hard to separate myth from reality. Dr. Jack Newman's Guide to Breastfeeding will help you sort all that out. This book is based on my understanding of breastfeeding and breastfeeding issues, which comes from the experience of my own family, learning from others interested in lactation, and more than 29 years of helping mothers with breastfeeding problems. The mothers who came to me taught me a lot as well. The knowledge I have gained over the years has helped many women breastfeed successfully, despite some difficult challenges along the way. That help is what I'm offering in this book. I readily admit that I do not always do things as others might. I differ from many lactation specialists and doctors, for example, in my dislike of the use of the vast majority of measurements, such as absolute reliance on weighing and counting, and, more recently, the baby's blood sodium level, as the approach to understanding what is going on with a particular mother and baby. I don't find it helpful to weigh babies frequently. I don't find it helps a mother overcome problems to wake her baby every 3 hours either, because I believe that a baby who is breastfeeding well doesn't need to be woken up. He'll let you know when he is hungry, especially if he is close to you. And if the baby is not feeding well, his going to the breast more often won't help. Drinking nothing 8 times a day is no better than drinking nothing 6 times a day. The issue for me is whether the baby is feeding well or not. My approach is based on observing mothers and babies and giving them help, support, and information. Even with such aid, very few mothers will not be able to breastfeed, or will not be able to breastfeed exclusively. But for the majority of women, these factors can make the difference between breastfeeding going well or not. When I speak at conferences about breastfeeding, I am almost always asked how I became interested in this field. I find the question a bit strange, given the importance of breastfeeding in the health and development of a baby. Surely it is a very appropriate area for a pediatrician to be interested in. In the past, some physicians took an interest in breastfeeding only in order to find alternatives to it. A way had to be found to feed infants whose mothers had died, for example. So infant formula was developed, and through trial and error, yes, errors were common and still are, improved so that babies usually survived and even thrived. But otherwise, physicians saw breastfeeding as women's territory. So how did I end up specializing in helping women breastfeed? In medical school, I learned nothing about breastfeeding. We had one lecture on infant feeding. Breastfeeding was mentioned during 1 minute of the hour-long lecture, the pediatrician saying that breast was best because the milk was always at the right temperature and came in such cute containers. Really? During my 4th-year medical student rotation of obstetrics and gynecology, I was asked by the resident at the 6-week postpartum clinic to see a new mother, ask her how she was doing, if she had any symptoms, examine her uterus and her breasts. When I examined her breasts, milk shot out at least a meter. I was amazed. What was going on here? What was that? They hadn't prepared me for this in medical school. Surely they should have mentioned something about the secretion that occurs in the breast after birth. I knew it was not possible for the mother to have milk, because it was routine to give the mothers an injection immediately after birth to dry up their milk. That's all I ever got in medical school about breastfeeding. Breastfeeding was so unimportant in the curriculum that there was not a single question about it on the final exams. Unfortunately, this hasn't changed much. Even pediatric residents get little or no practical information about breastfeeding. A few years later, I saw a woman breastfeeding in the market in San Cristobal de las Casas, Mexico. It was such an unusual sight for me that I took a photo of her. How third world of her, I thought. Good National Geographic photo. Then my wife and I had our first baby in 1976. I cannot tell you why neither Adele nor I ever considered anything for our son except breastfeeding. Our experience with Daniel taught us that though breastfeeding is supposed to be natural, it is not always easy. But our baby was breastfed exclusively, except for a few bottles of sugar water here and there, when he seemed to want to nurse all the time. And no, I would not recommend that today. Since I was the only doctor in the small village where we lived at the time, and my wife was the only nurse, we didn't have anyone to ask. We muddled through. Daniel breastfed until he was almost 4 years old. Because I was now the father of a breastfed baby, I became interested in the topic. I began to notice news reports about babies in Africa and other parts of the world who were dying because they were not breastfed. I realized that most of the pediatricians I was working with knew very little about breastfeeding, not even the little I had learned watching Adele breastfeed Daniel. Breastfeeding did not come up at all as a topic of discussion. Doctors never asked women if they were breastfeeding or if they wanted to, and all the babies in the special care unit were fed formula by bottle. The notion of using breast milk for the premature babies was never even discussed. Then I moved to the Hospital for Sick Children, HSC, in Toronto. There, breastfeeding was mentioned more often, mostly to say it was getting in the way of measuring the baby's fluid intake. One older staff pediatrician mentioned that his children had been breastfed and that he felt it was important. That impressed me. But generally, formula was used without a thought. In the intensive care unit, we wrote orders for formula without even asking if the mothers were providing milk. The mothers were always elsewhere, since there were no births at the hospital for sick children. After finishing my residency in pediatrics, I went to work in South Africa in 1981. The experience confirmed what I had heard about the horrors of bottle feeding in circumstances of poverty, lack of clean water, and lack of understanding about bottle feeding. Every day, babies died because they were not breastfed. Even if they were partially breastfed, they frequently got seriously ill, and often died because the water used to prepare the formula was contaminated, and the babies got fewer of the immune factors in breast milk that fight infections. The mothers almost never had enough money to buy sufficient formula, so they watered it down. Starving babies and children were admitted every day to the hospital. I realized that if we could institute 3 fairly simple public health measures, we would reduce the flood of sick children to a more manageable level. 1. All children would be immunized. Every day children died of measles. Polio was common, tetanus not infrequent. Whooping cough was less common, but devastating when it did occur. 2. All the tuberculosis contacts would be followed up and treated. Tuberculosis was an epidemic. 3. All babies would be breastfed exclusively to about 6 months, and would continue to be breastfed for 2 years and beyond. I couldn't do everything, so I concentrated on helping mothers breastfeed. This seemed to me to be easier and less expensive to accomplish than tackling the other issues. Little did I know how much resistance would be put up by the formula companies and by other physicians, especially some of the physicians in the private hospital for whites. I did get lots of support from most colleagues and co-workers. The nurses at the hospital were incredible. They could get babies breastfeeding who had been off the breast for weeks, and they could increase dwindling milk supplies like magic. I know now that I should have paid much more attention to what the nurses were doing. But I didn't. At the time, I thought there wasn't much to know about breastfeeding. You just put the baby to the breast, right? I'd figured out that you don't give bottles or time feedings, but that was it. When I returned to Canada, I went to work in the Hospital for Sick Children Emergency Department as a staff pediatrician. Virtually every day, I saw mothers and babies suffering with breastfeeding problems. What was striking was how lousy the breastfeeding information they were getting was. Not only was the advice bad, but it often defied logic and common sense. The bad advice was widespread. I heard the same thing repeatedly from different mothers. I did what I could to help, but could see that there were systemic problems. One day, our chief of emergency suggested that we should take 4 hours a week to do something other than emergency, to prevent burnout. So I decided to start a breastfeeding clinic. My experiences in the emergency department had shown me that there was a definite need. During the first full year of the clinic, 1985, only 70 mothers and their babies came. But slowly the clinic got busier. I knew very little, really, but some of the mothers managed, and that encouraged me, and I was learning all the time. The success of the clinic created its own momentum. The word soon spread. I began to attend seminars on breastfeeding and to learn from the mothers I worked with and other breastfeeding experts. I realized that many of the issues were caused by the lack of training of nurses and doctors in breastfeeding and how to help mothers breastfeed. I now believe that more than 90% of the difficulties women have are preventable. Naively, I thought that hospitals, doctors, and nurses would want to know how their policies and advice were causing breastfeeding difficulties for the women they worked with. I started writing letters to the hospital staff, explaining what the problems were. The response wasn't quite what I expected. I got angry letters back, insisting that the mothers I had seen had not told me the truth about their experiences in the hospital. Sometimes I would simply be told to mind my own business. Sometimes people would write to the chief of pediatrics to complain about me. But I couldn't stop being concerned about the babies who cried and suffered because they weren't getting enough milk. The mothers who struggled with agonizingly sore nipples and painful breasts, and the many other problems caused by breastfeeding mismanagement. In 1992, the breastfeeding clinic at HSC closed, and I began to see women and babies at other hospitals around the city of Toronto. Eventually, along with lactation consultant Edith Kernerman, I opened the International Breastfeeding Center. Now we see approximately 2,500 mothers and babies every year. I speak at conferences and workshops around the world. Unfortunately, the doctors and nurses who need to be at the conferences the most are generally the ones who don't attend. Once one takes up a cause, it becomes more and more difficult to ignore the real issues. As I learned more, I began to see how the formula companies aggressively and unethically marketed their products. I began to see how the health system collaborated quite willingly with the formula companies. I began to see that infant feeding was not a question of the mother making an informed choice between breastfeeding and bottle feeding. Not at all. I realized the whole system works against breastfeeding mothers and babies. We have stacks of research, even more than mentioned in the first edition of this book, to show that breastfeeding is important for the health and optimal development of babies and the health of the mother. And yet it is too often treated as unimportant. In my efforts to support breastfeeding, I sometimes found myself in conflict with obstetricians, pediatricians, and hospital nurses, not to mention dietitians, who were concerned because they couldn't measure everything, radiologists who told mothers they couldn't breastfeed after MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, scans, anesthetists who told mothers they couldn't breastfeed after a general anesthetic, and many other health professionals who seemed to recommend weaning in almost any situation. I found myself in opposition to child protection services that believe separation of breastfeeding mothers and babies is not a problem, and judges in family court who believe fathers deserve to have alternate weeks with their babies, even if it means destroying the breastfeeding relationship. Breastfeeding should never be expendable. Only under extraordinary circumstances should breastfeeding be interrupted. It is too important to the physical and mental health of the child and the mother for them to give it up the way one might give up ice cream. The purpose of this book is to empower women. Their right to breastfeed and their baby's right to be breastfed should be paramount. It is more important than the comfort of the person sitting near them in the restaurant who is offended by seeing a baby at the breast. It is more important than the physician's desire to recommend a particular drug for the mother without bothering to find something compatible with breastfeeding, which is almost always possible. It is more important than the hospital routines and paperwork that take up the time of the postpartum nurses. My hope is that this book will help mothers and fathers understand how breastfeeding works, how it can be made a wonderful experience for both mother and baby, how problems can be overcome, and how the practice is being undermined. You will find information about getting breastfeeding off to a good start, dealing with challenging situations, and handling breastfeeding in special circumstances. I also hope to counteract some widely held myths about breastfeeding, myths that can become obstacles to the new mother. Breastfeeding is important. It is worth the effort to overcome difficulties so that it can succeed. Because it's important, we need to change our medical system and our society so that breastfeeding becomes easier and the norm. It's been a slow process, but we're getting there. Unfortunately, after many years, there have been steps backward as well. But each mother who has a happy, successful breastfeeding experience brings us one step closer to a society where breastfeeding is, once again, the norm. Part 1. The normal way to feed a baby. Chapter 1. Why breastfeeding is important. Breastfeeding is good for the baby, good for the mother, good for the family, and good for society. We have plenty of evidence to show that this is true. The real evidence and the real risks of artificial feeding. Healthcare providers, childbirth educators, and others often talk about the advantages of breastfeeding. But to describe the differences between breastfeeding and artificial feeding this way assumes that artificial feeding is the norm. The warning messages on packages of cigarettes don't say non-smokers may have lower rates of heart disease or lung cancer. They say smoking increases your risk of heart disease and lung cancer. This perspective makes a difference in how statistics are presented. One study announced that women who had been breastfed as infants had a decrease of 25% in breast cancer rates when compared to women who were fed formula as infants. More accurately, women who were fed formula as infants had a 33.3% increase in breast cancer rates. Looks more significant, doesn't it? It is breastfeeding that is the normal way to feed a baby. There are risks to artificial feeding. We often assume that if breastfeeding is not possible, a rare situation, formula is the second best solution. But the World Health Organization, WHO, states that second best would be the mother's own milk, pumped or expressed, and fed to her baby, perhaps with a cup or a tube. This is only second best because feeding at the breast enhances the development of neuronal connections in the baby's brain, helps with the development of the baby's jaw and facial muscles, and allows the transfer of germs back and forth between the mother and the baby, which helps protect the baby against infection and allergies. Expressed milk won't provide those important factors or nurture the unique, close relationship between mother and baby that is also an essential part of breastfeeding. If expressing milk is impossible, the third feeding suggestion on WHO's list is screened donated milk. Only if that is also unavailable would artificial baby milk feedings be used, the fourth best solution. There is also a mutual relationship in breastfeeding. When the baby fusses or shows he wants to feed, the mother's milk begins to let down, so that breastfeeding both fills the baby's stomach and soothes him, and at the same time relieves the pressure of milk in the mother's breast and releases hormones that make her feel calmer and more loving. Mother and child reinforce those good feelings in each other. Risks of not breastfeeding. The risks of feeding a baby with anything other than the milk nature designed for him are real, and they are a concern, even in societies where medical care and treatment for the problems caused by not breastfeedings are readily available. In some parts of the world, the use of breast milk substitutes means many babies will not survive. While the vast majority of bottle-fed babies in North America will live, that doesn't mean the health problems and risks are not real and potentially serious. Let's look at some of those risks. Contamination. The name formula makes artificial infant milk seem very scientific, but most formulas are just cow's milk modified with other ingredients. Some use soy milk as the basis. As with all manufactured items, mistakes are sometimes made in preparing or processing formula. Formulas have been frequently recalled because important ingredients were left out, the labels were wrong, bacteria were found in the cans, etc. This can happen with any product, but it matters more with formula. If an important ingredient is missing, the effect on the baby can be devastating. Babies have suffered brain damage and permanent developmental delays because of chloride-deficient formulas. Babies have become ill with diseases such as meningitis, from contaminated formulas. A recent study of several brands of formulas found that some cans contained more than 4 times the amount of vitamin D.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?